Hey, I'm Pastor Stephen, and today we're going to continue our study in the book of Galatians. The title of our study is called Set Free. Today we're going to talk about your story. Your gospel story is your freedom story. Galatians is all about freedom. Paul is trying to help us to understand how we can be set free by embracing the gospel and its power to transform our lives and the lives of others. Our rescue is a story that spans thousands of years and has the power to not only just transform our lives, but to transform and change the lives of others. It is your story of redemption, your rescue story, your story of freedom. So we're going to be in Galatians chapter 1, verses 11 through 24. If you want to go ahead and read that with me, it says this: Dear brothers and sisters, I want you to understand that the gospel message I preach is not based on mere human reasoning. I received my message from no human source, and no one taught me. Instead, I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ. He says in verse 13, you know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion, how I violently persecuted God's church. I did my best to destroy it. I was far ahead of my fellow Jews in my zeal for the tradition of my ancestors. But, verse 15 says, even before I was born, God chose me and called me by his marvelous grace. Then it pleased him to reveal his son to me so that I would proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. As we discover what it means to be set free, let's begin by discovering our story. And so the first thing we need to understand is your story comes from God. As we just read this first portion, verses 11 and 12, Paul begins this passage by making it known that the message that he preached, the message that he received, was not something that he came up with. It was not something that someone else told him. It was directly from Jesus Christ. And that's what he says here. He says, I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ. See, your story is important. Why? Because it is simply that, your story. Stories can be similar, but they are not the same. Jesus met you in your life right where you were, right when you needed him. It was in his timing and in his plan. That's the power of the gospel. It is the story of your freedom. No one can take away what God did for you. It cannot be changed. It cannot be altered because it happened to you. It is your story, and your story comes from God, and it is what God has done for you. And so we need to embrace our story and recognize that our story comes from God. And this is what Paul did. He embraced his story, and it became the foundation of his message to the Gentiles and to the Jews, or just whoever would listen. As he wrote much of the New Testament, most of his story and much of his story is embedded in each one of these New Testament writings. So your story comes from God. So you need to embrace your story. You need to understand that your story is the basis for your freedom. So not only should we understand that your story comes from God, we need to understand that your story is personal. It cannot be changed. It cannot be altered. It happened to you, and that's why your story is personal. Verse 13, he says, you know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion, he says, how I violently persecuted God's church. I did my best to destroy it. But verse 15 says this, but even before I was born, God chose me and called me by his marvelous grace. Then it pleased him to reveal his son to me so that I would proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. See, your story of freedom is about embracing the gospel. It is about understanding that God made it personal for you. It is your story of how God saves you to send you, how he has called you to commission you. Paul considers his personal story to be the power of God. because it is personal. It happens to you. It didn't happen to me. Your story didn't happen to me. My story didn't happen to you. It is how God came into your life and changed you and utterly changed the course of your life if you're following Him. See, for me, my story began at church camp at Bud Creek when I fully understood the message of Jesus Christ. And I often say it's like flipping a light switch on. Like I was sitting there listening to people tell their stories about how they came to Christ. And as I listened to each one of those stories, I realized I didn't have a story like that. So I went, excused myself, and I found a place where I could be alone. And I just prayed to God and I said, God, I realize I don't have a story. I don't have a rescue story. I don't have a freedom story. And I need you to save me. And it was as simple as calling out to Him for the need that I had for Him to save me in my sin and to come into my life and have and start a relationship with me and to save me from my sins. And He did. And that moment, it was like a light switch just flipped on, and I understood everything. And I realized that I needed Christ, and He was my Savior, and I accepted that gift. And that's my story, and it is personal for me. And there are different parts to that story, different elements that help me to remember that. Because this story of mine displays the power of God. In verses 13 through 20, Paul continues and says, that I would be able to proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. But verse 20, he says, I declare before God that what I am writing to you is not a lie. And verse 23, he goes down and says, all these people knew that, they said this, all they knew was that people were saying, the one who used to persecute us is now preaching the very faith he tried to destroy. And they praised God because of me. Your story testifies to the power of God. Paul said in verse 23, people were saying, the one who used to persecute us is now preaching the very faith he tried to destroy. And then they praised God because of Paul. Your story testifies to the power of God. When people notice the change in your life, they notice the life that you lead because of the freedom of the gospel. They begin to see the power of God. Your testimony shouts God's glory. Everyone notices the power of God because of the change in your life. And everybody noticed the power of God because of the change that was in Paul. They noticed he was different. No longer was he a persecutor. Now he was a preacher. So how has your life displayed the power of God? How has your life revealed the glory of God? Or how has your testimony shown God's power? Maybe you don't have a personal testimony. Maybe you don't have a personal freedom story. Today is a perfect time for you to give your life to Christ and begin your story with Jesus. Today is the day for you to begin your story. See, your story, it comes from God. Just as Paul's story came from God, it's from direct revelation from Jesus. Jesus manifests Himself to you and shows you that you need Him in your life. And we can become free from sin when we accept Christ. It is your personal story. It happens to you. Yes, it is a story that is both personal and public at the same time. And your story testifies to the power of God. So how is your story? What is your story like? Share your story with someone. Share your story on Facebook. Share your story on Instagram. Share your story on Snapchat or whatever. Share your story with friends and family. Let people know the story of how you have freedom in Jesus Christ because He died for you and gave you new life. And the power of God is in your testimony. And the power of God is in a changed life that shouts what Christ has done. Multiple times in the Gospels, you see that as Jesus encounters people and He changes their life, the first thing they have to do is run and tell people the story of how their life was changed. I think of John chapter 4, the woman at the well. After she encountered Christ, the first thing she did was run to the very people that didn't want to have anything to do with her and shout, "Come see the Christ. This man told me everything that I have ever done. This is the Messiah." For you have to share your story. So, do you have a story? Then share it. If not, today is a perfect day for you to begin your story with Jesus. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate every one of you that watches these videos. And my prayer is that this is helping you in your walk with Christ as we discover our stories, we discover the gospel and the power of the gospel in our lives, how we can be set free from the prison of sin. Maybe it's helping you in some way. And that's my prayer. If you need to reach out, just reach out to me. Text me, call me, send me a message. Whatever I can do for you, I can pray for you, whatever it is, let me know. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next week as we talk about how our freedom can unite us. See you next week.